We know the areas that are involved in conscious experiences in humans, and if you lack those areas, you must not be conscious. But evolution tells us time and again that different structures evolve to serve similar functions. So crustaceans don't have a visual cortex, anything like that of a human, but they still manage to see. Most fishes don't have lungs, but they still manage to breathe. So why is it that when it comes to the mind, whether it's cognitive capabilities like intelligence or conscious states, should we continue to make man the measure of all things?
I'm delighted to chair this panel discussion on the more than human world, consciousness and the more than human. I want to begin by invoking a friend and colleague of all of ours, someone named David Abram, who he calls himself a natural philosopher, sometimes a geophilosopher. David Abram wrote a book in 1996 called The Spell of the Sensuous, which if you have not read, I urge you to read. It might be it's certainly one of the most influential books for me in the last 5 to 6 years. I didn't read it, of course, when it came out in 1996, and in some ways I'm glad I didn't. I don't think I was ready for it. But when I did read it, I invited him to the Center for the Study of World Religions. This was 5 years ago, and then again we invited him to come back for a year. And in that year, which David was with us, all 4 of us participated in a reading group led by Rachael and Natalia. I'll say something more about that very briefly. But I invoke David because I believe it is David who coined the phrase more than human world to evoke all the forms of consciousness, sentience that we're surrounded by. What does he call them? The other enfleshed neighbors. And I mention the more than human rather than say the non-human world, because the phrase more than human, I think, suggests an important ambiguity, or it leaves open a question. So often when we talk about animals and plants and other forms of consciousness, there is, I think, an implicit assumption that they are simpler, that they exist on a scale at which we comfortably sit at the top. And I think that David's phrase, the more than human, suggests that we question that assumption. And I think you'll see that reflected in today's panelists. So let me introduce them in turn. Rachael Peterson is a recent graduate of the Harvard Divinity School. I had the great pleasure of working with her, and she has recently become the project lead on a new initiative the center has launched called Thinking with Plants and Fungi. That initiative grew out of a reading group that she and Natalia have led for 2 years called Plant Consciousness Reading Group. And one of the questions of that reading group was whether consciousness is the right category to use when thinking about the distinctive capacities of plants. So they may speak to that in their remarks. And in fact, Christine was also a member of that reading group. So the 4 of us got to know each other very well through that. Natalia, in addition to leading that reading group, is a PhD student in the study of religion at Harvard University and the associate director of the program on the evolution of spirituality. She also leads a group that is called the Interspecies Dialogue Group. She may speak about that as well. And then finally, Christine Webb is a professor in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard, but will soon leave us for the fairer shores of NYU. I would like the camera to register that Rogan has just and a triumphant sign, okay, in the Department of Environmental and Animal Studies. So we'll hear from them in turn. I may ask a question or two and then open it to the floor. So without further ado, Rachel.
In my very brief introductory remarks, I'm hoping to accomplish two things. One is I want to give us a very cursory understanding of the contemporary conversation on plant consciousness, which is very much rooted in a field called plant neurobiology, which has been kind of capturing the public imagination through thinkers like Suzanne Simard, the forest ecologist, Merlin Sheldrake, the expert on fungi, and Monica Gagliano, among others. But perhaps more importantly than simply orienting us, I then want to move on into what I think is at stake, and even posing the question, are plants conscious? At a footnote here, I will use consciousness and sentience interchangeably, broadly to refer to what we spoke about this morning, the sort of Thomas Nagel primary consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, something it is like to be. Just a quick note, I'm not interested in evangelizing for those of you who are sitting here like bracing because you don't want to believe or don't believe that plants are conscious. Truly, I think what's more interesting is asking what is at stake, which is what we're going to be doing today in this conversation. And sprinkled throughout, I hope to inspire us and remind us just how freaking cool plants are. And strange, they are very strange, and their strangeness, I think, should not be underestimated, and I think this radical alterity of plants is an asset rather than a detriment in this conversation on sentience, and I will make that point later more vociferously. It's worth, I think, starting with two important evolutionary adaptations that help us account for the weirdness of plants. The first is simply that they are autotrophs. So they make their own food, and in particular, they are heliotrophs, meaning they literally eat light, y'all. Like they eat light. What more do you want? And that means another thing has happened to them evolutionarily is that they have developed what's known as a sessile lifestyle. They do not move. Well, they do move, but they don't locomote, and there is a distinction. Because sunlight and CO2 are readily available, plants have developed a unique biology that requires them to constantly create new ways to be exposed to the world, to take in its light, its air, its water. They maximize this exposure by maximizing their surface area. To live for a plant then is to grow, and to grow is to expose. Since they can neither seek nor flee, they have become incredibly attuned to the nuances of their environment, developing acute apparatuses to sense light, water, gravity, temperature, soil structure, nutrients, toxins, microbes, etc. The list goes on. They are in constant, absolute continuity and communion with their surroundings. This radical exposure and adherence is why the philosopher Emanuele Coccia says that plants are the most intense, radical, and paradigmatic form of being. He says that to interrogate the plant, then, is to interrogate the world. Whereas for Coccia, the lack of locomotion elevates the plant. Throughout antiquity, locomotion was often conflated with things like soul, or evidence of things like soul, mind, and life itself. And this goes all the way back to Aristotle, whose three-part typology of souls considered plants to be a sort of deficient animal on account of their lack of locomotion, which Natalia here will speak much more in depth about shortly. This Aristotelian hangover accounts in part for the fact that throughout the 20th century, up until the 20th century, attempts to understand plants mostly rested on fundamental aspects of their physiology, cell biology, biochemistry, etc. It was really interesting earlier, Simon, when you mentioned La Mettrie's book, Man, a Machine. In 1748, Metrie published a companion book called Man, a Plant. The insinuation being, of course, that plants are machines by the transitive property. So this kind of association of machines with plants goes back very much to the heart of scientific reductionism. But this was true until recently, when a controversial new scientific study emerged, arguing that in addition to studying plant physiology, we should study their behavior. This is a very controversial term when applied to plants, but methodologically has been enabled by advances in things like time-lapse photography and electrophysiology. This really took off in 2006 when a bold group of scientists called for the establishment of the field of plant neurobiology, again, very controversial, with the goal of understanding how plants perceive their circumstances and respond to environmental input in an integrated fashion. They argue that their experimental evidence indicates that plants' behavior is not simply environmentally or genetically determined, but that it is intentional, adaptive, flexible, and goal-oriented. This means that categories we once assumed were exclusive to humans and other non-human animals, things like intelligence, learning, kin recognition, memory, are now being applied to plants. And Christine, I think, will speak more about this and more about, I think, how oftentimes this science is controversial, not because of the findings per se, but because of the language that's being used to interpret the findings. A subset of these scientists go even further to argue that plants are sentient. They contend that if we understand consciousness, as some people do, many people actually in the scientific field, if we understand consciousness as a biological adaptation, we cannot a priori limit it to animals and humans simply because plants lack a nervous system. They propose that plants may have something non-neural that still fits the criterion for phenomenal consciousness. In short, there is indeed something it is like to be a plant. So, even if you're not convinced, and we haven't had time yet to go over some of these specific experiments, perhaps we can talk about those later, what is at stake even in posing this question, are plants conscious or sentient? Well, a really obvious question or thing at stake to start is that they challenge our neurocentrism. They challenge the idea, our anthropocentric or zoocentric tendency to assume that the mind or the real ends and begins between our ears. Cast in more cognitive science terms, plants provide a useful case study to entertain theories of consciousness that are substrate independent, whether those theories are panpsychism, biopsychism, bionaturalism, the cellular basis of consciousness, or things like integrated information theory. However, I think the stakes are much cooler and much more interesting. And to explain why, I need to point out one frustration I have with this contemporary plant neurobiology conversation. My problem with it, in short, is that the very potential it presents, that is, to take plants seriously as agents in their own right, is foreclosed by the very categories and methods that are being deployed. So let me point out some of these contradictions. So while on the one hand, these scientists argue that plants don't require a brain to be conscious, they spend an inordinate amount of time arguing that plants have something analogous to animal brains in terms of chemistry and electrophysiology, going as far to point out the shared neurotransmitters between plants and animals, things like GABA, histamine, serotonin. They're very fond of pointing out, this has been known for centuries now, if you put a sensitive plant, has anyone ever seen or touched a sensitive plant? So you touch it and it closes its leaves. It's a darling child of plant science because it moves on a scale that we can observe. If you put it in a bell jar with general anesthetics, it will not move, right? So they're very fond of pointing to these findings to say that plants have something like a brain. So a simplified way to summarize the message of plant neurobiology might be that, quote, this is my gloss here, plants have human things but in plant form, or plants are doing human things but in plant form. Take, for example, the following statement from Stefano Mancuso, who's a very prominent plant biologist. He says, plants have all 5 senses humans do, and 15 more. I don't know about y'all, but I'm pretty interested in those 15, perhaps even more interested in those 15. Talk about plurality of perception. I don't know if Anil is here, but, and I'm very interested in how those 15 may not be just incidental to plant consciousness, but perhaps central to it. Make no doubt about it, plants are doing human things in plant terms perhaps, but they are also very much doing plant things in plant form. And I don't think we can hold that against them. I made John Cleese laugh. I'm done, I can go home. So to continue to elaborate on what I think is at stake here, I'm going to get a little weirder, and I'm going to bring in some of my own research. Some of you in this room know that I am a translator of the 19th century psychologist, philosopher, iconoclast Gustav Fechner, who in 1848 wrote a very strange, compelling book called On the Soul Life of Plants. He was an interesting person I can speak more about in the Q&A, but he was completely tormented by the mind-body problem. And that torment was evidenced in his biography. He spent half of his life studying the physical sciences. Meanwhile, he was secretly reading Oken and Schelling and Schiller, and he was completely obsessed with the sort of romantic sweeping vision of German Naturphilosophy. And he ultimately had a breakdown, and for him, plants were sort of the linchpin for his healing and solving the mind-body problem. So I'm going to bring in some quotes from his book, which I've translated, on the soul life of plants. Fechner, does the very nature of plant life perhaps defy psychological interpretation? In addition to, souls, so all the atheists in the room, he uses the word soul, but many of the things he indexes to soul are very shared with the things we index to the contemporary definitions of consciousness. So if it helps, just replace soul with consciousness. Okay, does the very nature of plant life perhaps defy psychological interpretation? In addition to souls which run about and cry and feast, might there not be souls that bloom in stillness, that quench thirst by slurping dew, that exhale fragrance, that satisfy their highest longings by budding and reaching towards light? For Fechner, the pluriform weirdness of reality was grounds to include more of it rather than exclude more of it from the realm of consciousness. For Fechner, reality unfurls itself in multifaceted forms, seeking to experience itself through vine, tooth, thumb, and claw. Fechner calls this the principle of complementarity. Every living being, he says, constitutes, so to speak, a differently shaped sieve, which filters different sensations from nature accordingly. This is one of my favorite quotes from him. I think it really gets to this odd humility that we've been calling for. He says, "It is not what I share with another soul, but what I don't, that makes it a soul." It's a pretty profound statement. In fact, Fechner imagines that plants might apply their own category of soul to humans and find us very much lacking. A plant may assume, based on their own experience, that the soul is evidenced through this capacity to self-generate and self-adorn, leaf by leaf. The oak might find us on these grounds very soulless indeed. Inspired by Fechner, I think we can neither surrender sameness nor difference when it comes to examining plants. Perhaps we need to, as Jeff calls us to do in his book, The Superhumanities, render difference ontological. But we must discern the tools necessary to apprehend both sameness and difference in plants to help us get at this pluriform weirdness of reality. That's why I think one of the biggest things at stake in the plant consciousness conversation is the invitation to wed the empirical with the imaginal. I don't think there is any true intimate ontological knowledge of the vegetable without an alliance between science, philosophy, poetry, practice, non-ordinary ways of knowing that bring us closer to the plant while distancing us from ourselves. Expanding our methodological toolkit is imperative since I agree with the philosopher Michael Marder, who says that plants, in their very being, accomplish a lived destruction of metaphysics. Here he's referring to Western metaphysics. And I'll give you an example of this destruction of metaphysics. Plants, for me, are anti-Cartesians, Cartesianalists, anti-Cartesians par excellence. So I think in this room, many of us know, of course, Descartes famously posited two substances, separate substances, mind and matter. More specifically, he termed these the res cogitans, the thinking thing, and the res extensa, the extended thing. Note here how thinking is active, a present participle, thinking, and extension or matter is passive, extended, the extended thing. But plants enact their cognition through phenotypic plasticity, growth. They think by growing, right? So there's, for example, we can talk more about these experiments, but Monica Gagliano, who's a plant scientist, did an associative learning experiment with plants, similar to, for those of you who know Pavlov's dog. She created a Y-shaped tube in which I believe it was a pea plant was grown. And on the one hand was sunlight, light, food, and the other hand was a fan which was blowing on the plant. Long story short, she was able to teach the plant to associate that fan with light, so that fan with food, such that the plant would grow towards the fan. So again, it's this plant is thinking, it's making a choice, and by doing so, it's generating new leaves. Its extension is its thought. Plant bodies are palimpsests of mind. They manifest their intentionality through extensionality. For plants, extending is intending. Like, imagine if I grew a new arm for every sentence that I wrote of this talk, and I didn't lose the old arm, but it was passed on to the new arm. Then you would start to get at something like what it's like to be a plant. Perhaps this is why plants prove to be a very slippery slope or gateway drug for Fechner, one that would lead him to a full-blown dual aspect monism, pantheism. Maybe your parents warned you, don't do plants. They're very, very dangerous. In his review of Nana, the philosopher Hermann Lotze remarked, "One cannot search for the mind arbitrarily in plants, those darling children of fantasy, and remain satisfied with the existence of dead matter in rocks." I think all of us have been taunted by rock consciousness. It seems to be the ledge off which people want us to jump if we're going to talk about plants. They're like, why not rocks? So critics were taunting Fechner, like, why stop there? And indeed, he didn't. He extended this enmindedment, gave it a cosmic upgrade to stars, to the whole world, to the universe. He described plants as a little handle by which a big pot can be grasped. And for him, the pot was nothing short of a full-blown pantheism. So I'll end with what else is at stake, what I think is very importantly at stake in this plant consciousness conversation, which speaks a little bit to what Phil and I believe John also got at in their conversation around the crisis of meaning, for example. And that's the fact that plants are mind-altering. And I don't mean that in the obvious way. We can certainly talk about it in the obvious way, which is plants and fungi have evolved to, when ingested, when worked with, when allied with, to precipitate some of the most profound, spiritual, non-ordinary, transcendent, mystical experiences known to man. That is very much true. But I'm going to borrow something Natalia says, which I really love. She says, psychedelic plants are the ones screaming at us. They're the obvious ones. But the other plants are whispering, right? So plants seem to want to know us and to change us. And what happens when we listen to this whisper? The great American biologist E.O. Wilson says that rather than characterizing our current epoch as the Anthropocene, the age of the human, we should characterize it as the Eremocene, the age of loneliness. And I used to think he meant only the shattering silence where there should be birdsong, the unprecedented loss of species in our midst. But now I wonder if he equally refers to species loss as he does our incapacity or our impatience to fully meet the radically other lives of others. Our skepticism, I think, fills the earth with mewing, howling, slithering, blossoming shadows, ghosts of refused light. For Fechner, listening to the whisper of plants was what ultimately healed him from a 3-year nervous breakdown in which he went blind. And it was only on October 5th, 1843, when he walked into his garden and he removed his blindfold, that he saw, he says, the soul of a plant, and it healed him. He says, "I stepped out from my darkened room and into the blossoming garden for the first time with no bandage upon my eyes. It seemed to me like a beautiful glimpse beyond the boundary of human experience. Every flower shone towards me with a peculiar clarity, as if it were throwing its inner life outwards. The whole garden was transfigured as if it were not I, but nature that had arisen anew. And I thought to myself, one must only open one's eyes afresh to see nature once stale, alive again. One could hardly believe how new and alive nature appears to those who meet it with new eyes." Plants ushered Fechner across the bridge between inner and outer to a place where the distinction between visible and invisible lose their meaning. He would spend the rest of his life inviting his readers to follow the plant and cross over and view nature and mind with new eyes. Thank you. Why am I clapping for myself?
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah.
Natalia?
Whew. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Elizabeth and Sophie and Charles, for having us here today. As Charles said, my name is Natalia, and in addition to being a third-year candidate in the Committee for the Study of Religion at Harvard University, I'm also an herbalist, and I'm a wildlife rescue and rehabilitation apprentice. My overarching doctoral project is cross-disciplinary analysis on non-human personhood, sociality, ritualized relationality, and multi-species ethics. So I do a lot of lurking in neuroscience and in human evolutionary biology and organismic evolutionary biology departments, but I also lurk in the Divinity School, history of science, and in anthropology. And a great deal of that has been around comparative thanatology or death studies. So quickly, when I'm speaking about consciousness today, like Rachel, I'm speaking specifically of a sense of self, an interiority, a perspective, subjectivity, a capacity to engage, and I echo the appreciation for Nagel's definition and the association between consciousness and life, though I would argue that the boundary between life and death is very culturally situated. Like Rachel, I'm focusing on plants because just short of rocks, they are considered at the lowest ladder of consciousness, if they are considered at all. And yet in the material that I've been considering, they are pervasively present as subjects. My secondary field in my doctoral work is Celtic studies, where I look at plant personhood and trans-species soul migration. And so that's where I'm going to start today, and also I'm going to take us on a little time hop of stories of relationships between humans and plants. So it begins with an Old Irish text collated in the 12th century, but identified as early as the 9th century. It tells of a warrior king gone mad, poet, prophet, as so many of them do, you know, and wandering through the wild forests of Ireland after being cursed by a priest for impiety. The frenzy of Sweeney, or the Bulia Swivna, Bulia meaning like vision or flight, which is not unlike a vision quest that we might, call today. It's a complex and often quite gory tale, but then curiously, in the very middle of the poem, Sweeney pauses to relate his love for the glen in which he lives. And here are two stanzas in translation. You, little you are conspicuous in graveyards. Ivy, little ivy, you are familiar in the dark wood. Holly, little shelterer, shudder against the wind. Ash, baneful, weapon in the hand of a warrior. The poem goes on this way for many pages, but I hope that you notice that even in just these two stanzas, the grammar is specific as it is in the Old Irish. It is in the vocative, and it is in the diminutive. The plants are addressed directly, and they are addressed with love. It has a repetitive ritual structure. Sweeney places the tree species within their specific contexts, identifying them first in the vocative and then naming them again in the diminutive before extolling their capacities and praising them for the care that they have shown him as well as other people. So let's fast forward to the 17th century in Scotland, in the village of Aberfoyle, which is about an hour west from here. And while this isn't exactly plant specific, it is geography specific. In the posthumously published, The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, Episcopalian minister Robert Kirk details the nature of second sight and a belief in a variety of supernatural beings amongst his Highlander parishioners in the late 1600s. The project articulates a coexistence of worlds, some human, some not, while directly engaging in Neoplatonism and scriptural exegesis. But it's all directly related to landscape. In fact, Kirk is very clear that the relationships are geographically specific. He writes that fairies are dressed like Scottish people, and that the minute that Scottish people leave Scotland, they no longer have access to those relationships or to those powers. And so throughout this brief but delightful essay, which I highly suggest everyone reads, Kirk emphasizes that his informants' confidence in the authenticity of their rich cosmology is not abnormal, nor are their experiences reducible to a pathology. He writes that his parishioners are, for the most part, candid, honest, and sociable people. And he explains that often these non-human entities will engage directly with humans or are spoken to directly by humans. So it did take some skill to figure out what the message might be from these entities, but as we know, fairies are quite mischievous. So So next, we fast forward to the 19th century folklore collection craze. And like the rest of Northern Europe, Scotland produced academics, aristocrats, and cultural advocates who traveled throughout the landscape, especially the Highlands, gathering material from communities whose ways of life were threatened by industrialization, agrarian land reorganizations, along with forced evictions and economic difficulties. In these folklore collections, and this is not at all exclusive to Gaelic-speaking areas, textual material that focused on plants, particularly incantations for safety or health or prosperity, often feature curiously similar grammar to that in the Bulia Swivna, though it's also quite religiously syncretic. For example, one piece from the Scottish collector Alexander Carmichael's Carmina Gaelica reads, "St. John's wort, St. John's wort, my envy, whoever has thee. I will pluck thee with my right hand, I will preserve thee with my left hand. Whoso findeth thee in the cattle fold shall never be without kine," which is another word for cattle. I often hear a comment that monotheism is to blame for the flattening of relationality in so-called Western countries, but the examples I've shared thus far are all from post-conversion Gaelic-speaking areas, and I think that's a critical relationship there. The interspecies engagement persists in language, and well-known scholars like Potawatomi ecologist Robin Wall Kimmerer, post-humanist Donna Haraway, eco-philosopher David Abram, who Charles brought up, have all spoken and written about what Kimmerer calls the grammar of animacy, a linguistic concept that refers to how different languages classify and treat living and non-living entities within their grammatical structures. But thus far, consciousness conversations, when they engage with Western communities, seem to only focus on the inheritance of the Greeks. When we write off animist or relational language as within primary sources present within cosmologies in European cultures, or explain away any documentation of intersubjective phenomenology with non-humans as either pathological or allegorical, we ignore entry points that may support a better understanding of how relational entanglements function, even in areas now considered disenchanted. To comment on a point made in the previous panel, we cannot even begin to discuss a general worldview on consciousness if that worldview is only rooted in one very specific philosophical thread, or even a dualist perspective that places East and West in some sort of contradiction, or in a contradiction. So I've been comparing my notes with friends who work in similar fields of cultural perceptions on plant consciousness. And for example, Rebecca Mendoza at Harvard Divinity School studies Mesoamerican metaphysics with the copal tree as her entry point. And she argues that we must take seriously that the same language is used to describe the tree and its various roles in ritual described within the codexes as the human body is described in Nawa. Likewise, Dr. Munjed Murad, who is a HDS alum, wrote his dissertation on the companion tree of the prophet in relation to the cross tree, arguing that the language surrounding these two traditions adamantly contends that these trees display piety, agency, and voice. And what I have found to be so special and enriching about these conversations with scholars in very different fields is the opportunity to build bridges and advocate for more recognition of the ways in which cultural formations of consciousness are present within the way we talk about other species. Rachael spoke of the pervasiveness of a zoo-centric approach within consciousness in the current research fields, and Christine will go into more depth about the similarities in the development between the fields of plant neurobiology and animal science. So here, in the space between their arguments, after throwing some plant personhood stories at you, I'll close by agreeing with Philip Goff that I don't think people know what philosophy is. What seems to be happening in the consciousness debate in most research spaces, including in those mentioned today, is a deep commitment to the scala naturae, later developed into the great chain of being. And I don't need to get into the history of how Platonism was adopted in early Christianity or revitalized in medieval theology, and again by the Cambridge Platonists in the 17th century, since that's already been discussed quite a bit. But the scala naturae likewise comprises the very bedrock of the scientific revolution in the West, which occurred during the same period as revitalized interest in the Platonist visions of the natural world and the Protestant Reformation. Philosophers and scientists seem to have appropriated the language of mind and spirit from the Scala Naturae, and it's, oh no, that's it. But instead have utilized the terms sentience, consciousness, intelligence. So it's the exact same ladder, but using slightly different language. And instead of God or mind, a perfection of unity of forms at the top, we have instead intelligence with humans at the top. And anyone that's deemed as lesser in the ladder, like plants, don't even get to engage in the concepts of what perfection might be. And my closing argument was that this is incredibly situated in a specific ontology. And most ontologies, including the ones that I mentioned today from the area that we're in and other very nearby areas, did not have this problem of who was conscious and who is not conscious. And so the next time that you're on a walk on this beautiful property, maybe pause and think about how that tree might feel, because I think that's the beginning, is to think about that there are other ways to think about consciousness, and it's not just through the inheritance of the Greeks. Thank you.
Thank you. Christine.
Hi, everybody. Yes, echoing the gratitude for bringing this group together, this beautiful place. So I am a primatologist by training, and I would say my research is driven by this growing awareness that the environmental crisis demands a profound shift in how we see other species and our place among them. And that leads to two kind of intersecting main lines of inquiry. So in the first case, my work focuses on how animals navigate their complex cultural and social and emotional worlds, and applying that knowledge to foundational questions in animal ethics and conservation. And lately, I've had the great privilege of working mostly with humans' closest living primate relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, across several different forested great ape sanctuaries in Central and Southern Africa. And then the second main line of my work, I'm really interested in how prevailing cultural norms and values in institutions shape the construction of scientific knowledge about other animals and nature more generally, including plants, which is one of the main reasons for my involvement in the reading group with these three. So in particular, my recent work engages critically with human exceptionalism and how this pervasive ideology gets perpetuated under the pretense of science. And I explore this in an upcoming book project called The Arrogant Ape. And one thing I wanted to talk about today in the context of this panel in particular, and it's part of the book, is how current debates in plant cognition and consciousness mirror historic debates about animal minds. And so I'm really curious what lessons we can learn from this history and trajectory of the study of animal consciousness for growing conversations about consciousness in other forms of life. And I think there are many interesting parallels and lessons here, but I want to touch on just three today. So first, and I think this won't come as a surprise to most in this room, fortunately, is that science repeatedly changes its mind. Today, many of us probably take it for granted that most animals are conscious. The science is relatively settled on this. So not just humans and other primates, but also birds and fishes and reptiles. There's even growing consensus amongst scientists and philosophers today that many different kinds of insects are conscious, and I can get into some of the experiments that are elucidating these conscious experiences in some way. But until quite recently, consciousness was not a serious topic of inquiry in animal science. It was only in 1998 that the zoologist Donald Griffin published an influential paper proposing to extend scientific research on animal behavior and cognition to include conscious experiences. So that was roughly 25 years ago. And prior to that, under the influence of behaviorism, animal minds more generally were considered off limits to serious scientific inquiry. So even using words like memory, thinking, experiencing, feeling, this was discouraged unless referring to some kind of mindless process. So in other words, animals didn't actually remember, they were just behaving as if they remembered. They didn't feel pain, they merely acted as if they felt pain. Likewise, those scientists who did push the boundaries of these conversations by attributing complex cognitive abilities to other animals were often seen as misguided and eccentric. Their evidence was considered dubious and far-fetched. So in my field of primatology, Jane Goodall's experiences always spring to mind. So Goodall found that chimpanzees had tool use, cooperative hunting, rich personalities and cultures. And while none of these are consciousness per se, they are typically viewed as cognitive capacities that are correlates of complex cognition or consciousness. And yet, scientific journals rejected some of her earliest papers in which she described these observations. So even though her findings were eventually recognized as groundbreaking scientific contributions, initially her observations of these qualities in other primates was deemed by the scientific establishment to be unscientific, anthropomorphic, or even sentimental. So the lesson here is that what may seem to some as scientifically outlandish and inconceivable as the notion that plants are conscious, cognitive beings today, can change in a matter of decades or years, as has already occurred in the context of research on animal minds. And this is not to say that it's going to follow the same trajectory or lead to the same resolutions or conclusions, but this history should make us cautious in a priori dismissing the possibility of mind and consciousness in other forms of life. So the second lesson I think debates in animal cognition have for the study of consciousness in the more than human world is the importance of moving beyond the human brain structure as the primary model or prototype for understanding cognitive and conscious experiences, and Rachel was touching on this earlier. But for a long time in animal science, there was a firm conviction that a nervous system centered on the brain was necessary for any kind of cognitive or conscious complexity. But in recent decades, studies have shown that animals considered highly intelligent and conscious often possess neural architectures that are vastly different from those of humans and other primates. So I think octopuses have been mentioned several times, but haven't necessarily been given the real estate that they deserve. So two of the most frequently cited examples of the importance of moving beyond the human brain structure as the blueprint for understanding consciousness. One is octopuses, where experiments have shown that octopuses exhibit markers of conscious experience, even though they lack a central nervous system. So even though they lack a nervous system that is centered on the brain. As many of you may know, 2/3 of an octopus's neurons are spread throughout her body, distributed amongst her 8 arms. And so some would even say that each arm has kind of a mini brain, allowing that arm to act independently, which gives octopuses the benefit of local and central control over their actions. So again, a very kind of different blueprint, a different architecture in a being who is considered to be intelligent and conscious. Birds provide another very useful illustration. So their relatively tiny brains have long been ridiculed, right? The colloquial bird brain. But on many metrics, birds outperform humans and other mammals and other primates on a number of different intelligence tasks. And so this raised questions among scientists: how could birds be so smart without a neocortex? The neocortex, as we've kind of learned, is the brain region in mammals thought to be associated with complex cognitive abilities and conscious experiences. And the answer lies in a region of the bird forebrain called the pallium, which functions in a similar manner to the mammalian neocortex, but with a key difference. So while the mammalian neocortex is organized into layers, the avian pallium is organized into clusters or nucleated. And this different structure allows birds to achieve comparable cognitive abilities in a completely different way. So just to zoom out, the usual argument against other species having consciousness at all is that their brain structure is so different from ours. And the reasoning goes something like this. We know the areas that are involved in conscious experiences in humans, and if you lack those areas, you must not be conscious. But evolution tells us time and again that different structures evolve to serve similar functions. So crustaceans don't have a visual cortex, anything like that of a human, but they still manage to see. Most fishes don't have lungs, but they still manage to breathe. So why is it that when it comes to the mind, whether it's cognitive capabilities like intelligence or conscious states, should we continue to make man the measure of all things? Okay, so that was the second lesson. The third and related insight I think animal cognition research can have for the study of consciousness in the more than human world more broadly is that cognition and perhaps also consciousness evolved to fit species-specific needs. So one of my favorite examples of this is how humans were long thought to be unique in their capacity for self-awareness, the capacity to distinguish the self from another, which at the time of these studies was kind of seen as either a correlate of consciousness or synonymous with consciousness. And this capacity for self-awareness is conventionally studied with what is called the mirror task. And in this classic, but I think highly flawed experiment, a mark is surreptitiously placed on a participant's body, and researchers see if that participant notices the mark upon viewing their reflection in the mirror. And most human children and other primates pass this test with flying colors, yet most other species fail. But of course, this task favors visually dominant species like humans and other primates. So let's think about dogs who navigate the world primarily through their sense of smell rather than sight. Other studies have used a novel design based on dogs' Umwelt or sensory world. Basically, they present dogs with an olfactory mirror, so a canister with their own scent, and then the scent of another dog, a canister with the scent of another dog. And for anyone who has dogs, they probably would not be surprised to learn that dogs can easily distinguish between their own scent and the scent of another dog, the olfactory mirror of themselves versus the other. In other words, at least according to this sort of classic study paradigm, but translated for an animal who navigates the world primarily through scent, they exhibited self-awareness. And so only by moving away from the primate-centric visual perspective and taking a dog's perspective of the world did we get the measurement right. And yet, despite this widespread, acceptance of the significance of smell to dogs, olfaction is typically neglected in canine cognition research. So a recent review of experiments in this field showed that 74% of studies published in the last century on dog cognition relied on visual test paradigms instead. So plants Umwelten, as Rachel was describing earlier, they have senses akin to R5 and then some. I think you said there were 15 additional senses. And there's huge diversity. There must be huge diversity within plants, right? Like comparing a bumblebee and a dolphin is probably akin to comparing a sunflower to geranium in terms of like which sensory systems, I don't like that word, but which senses are most active and present. So given this vast range of sensory and perceptual experiences, how can we design studies that truly account for and respect the unique ways that these plants and other animals perceive and engage with the world? Okay, so that is my spiel about how I think previous debates in animal science hold important lessons for understanding consciousness beyond humans. And I have some more examples and points, but I think at this point it's actually good to wrap it up and maybe open up the discussion and hear questions. So.
Thank you, Christine. All right, I want to begin by making two comments that will integrate some of what you've just heard with the earlier panels, and the second comment I hope will evolve into a question to put to you three, and then we'll open it to the whole group. So the first comment has to do with something that Natalia said, which I fully endorse, which is we need to think about other frameworks for consciousness than the predominant one that has come down to us from the Greeks. But I also want to say that even within that heritage, there is a tremendous amount of diversity that often gets silenced due to the influence of Aristotle. And so there's another way in which we don't all need to suffer from what Rachel called the Aristotelian hangover. And I'm thinking here of, Ian had referred to Heraclitus, and even more pertinent, I think, is Simon's citation of Thales, who is sometimes cited as the first philosopher in this tradition. And I just want to mention one thing about Thales, who, in addition to believing that everything that exists is some form of water in different states of matter, also is famous for two other claims. One, that everything is full of gods, and that even magnets have souls. Now, that last view, that a magnet has a soul, is probably not Thales thinking that magnets are peculiar, but that the fact that even something like a stone has a soul by virtue of the fact that it can attract something to it, that it moves, which is the characteristic definition of soul, means that perhaps ensoulment is very widely, perhaps universally distributed, and we have one form of panpsychism, perhaps not the form that Phil would like to endorse. So there's diversity within the Greeks, and there is diversity on this planet beyond the Greeks, and I fully endorse that view that we need to hear those other voices. Natalia also mentioned a book by a local author, Robert Kirk. Robert?
Mm-hmm. Robert Kirk.
Robert Kirk wrote The Secret Commonwealth. I didn't know he was so close. He was an hour away, although hour, of course, depends on what mode of transportation we're talking about. In Kirk's day, it was probably a little longer than an hour. But in any case, that book that Kirk wrote called The Secret Commonwealth has recently been borrowed by Philip Pullman in the latest installation of his second trilogy. He has two trilogies, His Dark Materials and The Book of Dust. The Book of Dust is not yet finished. The last installment of it was Secret Commonwealth. I cite that because Philip Pullman has, across these two trilogies, has welcomed us into a world replete with the more than human. Gods, or at least beings pretending to be gods, angels, demons, talking polar bears, other animals, fairies, spirits of place, rivers, full of agency, sentience, and consciousness. Now, you could say, that's all fine and good. Philip Pullman is a very good storyteller, and this is just fantastic fiction. I am not convinced that Philip Pullman is writing fiction. This is where this question will, I hope, evolve into a question for the panelists. So, insofar as that, Philip Pullman, very widely read novelist, whose two trilogies are together a kind of story about consciousness, and consciousness suffused through the universe through an elusive particle or matter called dust, seems to me that he's a kind of fellow traveler across these 3 days of thinking about him. And I note the fact that at least two, perhaps more people whose books are available downstairs have Philip Pullman blurbing them. I think, Phil, you have Philip Pullman. Ian, you have Philip Pullman. John, is he on your team too? I want Philip Pullman to blurb my book. So in any case, now comes the question. It seems to me that the popularity of Pullman, and more widely, there's a sense in which the kind of more than human consciousness that you each have unpacked so beautifully is more widely experienced than we may think it is. Like that we may be arguing with a worldview that is actually the provincial worldview. And so I want to know, what are the provinces of the worldview you're arguing against? And are they representational of the human experience globally or historically? I doubt that very much. And if not, do they hold particular authority and sway now? And if so, where? In some sense, are we arguing again, like, are we arguing with demographics? Do most people actually think that only humans are conscious? Or are we arguing with institutions and traditions of resources and power? You want to take that up?
I can just quickly add on to there's these cross-cultural insights that would suggest that there's a dominant ontology, but it's sort of a dominant minority view about consciousness. And I think the cross-cultural research is also complemented by the research in developmental psychology. There's been a number of interesting studies coming out in the last decade about how children don't come into the world wearing an anthropocentric lens when it comes to their relations with other forms of life and what they are willing to attribute to other forms of life. So I just want to put that out there as an additional piece of evidence that
but
perhaps...
that's often marshaled to precisely on the camp that wants to deny consciousness because of the idea being like, we grow out of that idea, right?
Right.
And
yeah.
so that's also presumably been
that we
used.
grow up to.
Yeah, we grow up, and cultures that regard consciousness as in plants and animals are essentially childlike cultures.
But it's also, I mean, the sort of intersection between the developmental and cross-cultural research is interesting because they show that sort of that tendency to regard the animacy of the living world, the consciousness of the living world as self-evident, is something that disappears more quickly in Western industrialized cultures who have less exposure and experience with nature and other animals. So it's very much about the experience that you have as well.
I do think that it is a relationship to power. I'm going to try to articulate what was going on in my brain and also on the last 2 pages of my writing. So Sabina Mayoko is a scholar mostly of contemporary practices of paganism, which isn't my area of research, but she wrote about how she was looking at she intended to look at how contemporary pagans think about the death of the non-humans who live with them, think about their pets. And as she was doing that, she ended up mostly interviewing Catholics and finding that Catholics, a great deal of her pool, had a belief in the Rainbow Bridge in one way or another. And she was like, this isn't based in your scripture. Where are you getting this idea?
Do you want to explain Rainbow Bridge in case?
Oh, that animals cross their pets, that animals when they die, it's a metaphor that animals go to heaven, so that they cross this thing called the Rainbow Bridge and you will find them again in heaven. And she questioned, like, this isn't, liturgically based, and in fact there's been plenty of arguments around the nature of the soul of animals in the history of Christian theology. But she called this vernacular animisms. And she argued that there are constantly vernacular animisms occurring. And that we all are developing relational experience. And we can think of family members or friends or spaces where someone might be incredibly, have a very, generally speaking, strict belief system about the world, and then make an exception for their horse or their dog or an animal who they had a connection with. And suddenly you're like, interesting that you have this little spot over here that you're allowing to exist in the rest of this very strict cosmology. So that's one part, is the vernacular animisms, and the other part is that, and I want to say this the way I actually feel about it. So. Is that there is the association of developmental psychology and cultures that are from colonized areas and areas that continue to suffer under the abuse of colonization. We know that social evolution is a racist concept. And we know that the continued projection of that hierarchy of how you engage and who you engage with as conscious is culturally situated. If we say that inability to grow out of it is in some way means that culture is lacking, that is a perpetuation of white supremacy in my perspective. And in order to dismantle those systems of supremacist, but very closed frame thinking that I think is not allowing us to see the possibilities or the relationships that exist all around us, or even see those vernacular ontologies of animism. And even the term animist and the way that has developed historically under Taylor's work and since then, and has only been recently reclaimed within religious studies and anthropology, I think it is related to power. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. That's a big part of it.
Yeah, I think you both articulated the sort of provinces that we're pushing back against quite well. Maybe I'll add in two sort of unrelated thoughts. One is that, I don't know if people saw this, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a study that came out that definitively proved that dogs love their owners. Yeah, and I think I'm a crazy dog person, and I think anyone who is a dog person might have rolled their eyes at this study. And sometimes I do wonder if we're sort of pushing back against a straw man, or sort of we're almost like ceding more territory to science by reifying the pushback, right? By saying, well, this isn't true. I already knew this, given my lived experience. Who are you to come in here? But I'm sympathetic to what Phil said of like wanting to hold these two things in tandem, which Fechner really wanted to do too, where it's like we just can't pick the vibesy option. Like we can't pick the option that feels good, but we need to honor our lived experience while also allotting space to scientific research. So I think that's a delicate balance. Another thing I wanted to add, which might segue into another topic, is something I've noticed every year with the Plant Consciousness Reading Group is the first week, I would say several ardent vegans come, and they don't come back. And I think one thing I'm pushing back against is in the West, and this is something that happened in animal studies, we're stuck with this paradigm in which we only afford beings moral status if they are sentient, which is usually indexed to feeling pleasure and pain. And I think that's a very narrow lane to relate to other beings. But like, can you imagine being at the bedside of someone and being like, are you conscious or not? Should I kill you or not? And I think this is like, in part, out of the fact that unless you're a farmer or a gardener or an herbalist, most of us, that is the point of relationship with plants. Every day is, do we eat it or not? Like, that is the choice we are making. But there are certainly other relational frames, other cultural frames that have different categories other than consciousness, or who create a personhood that's much broader than just has science proven if you feel pleasure or pain. So yeah, I feel like I'm pushing back against that as well.
Thank you. I think it's time to open it up, and I see in my peripheral vision Phil is right out of the gates, and I see John in the back, Marcus. Okay, so we have 3 in the queue already.
Thank you. That was all really, really fascinating. Can I just make a quick comment and then a question? Just on Philip Pullman. So we've had 3 public conversations now, actually, Philip Pullman and I, 2 of which are available on YouTube, just in case people are interested. And yeah, one thing I got out from him about panpsychism from our discussions, and I think it's connected, is he persuaded me it's very Copernican. Like, just as Copernicus persuaded us, we're not in the center of the universe, just one planet around one star in trillions and trillions. We panpsychists don't see consciousness as modeled on human consciousness. It's a very specific kind of, and I think that connected to a lot of what he's saying about, seeing consciousness in a broader sense. And just quickly about the Rainbow Bridge, one of my earliest memories as a very small boy at Catholic school was my schoolmate, obviously also a very small boy, asking at prayer time if we could say a prayer for his dog who'd just passed away. And the teacher said no, because dogs don't go to heaven.
No.
It's really stuck with me. Sorry, that doesn't go anywhere. It was just a little bit of an anecdote. But anyway, then just to Rachel's provoke some thought of, this is going to be another pedantic philosophy question. But anyway, just got me thinking about your thought that dualists couldn't make sense of the plant stuff and plants bringing together growth and cognition. I was thinking, is that true? I mean, if I'm trying to channel David Chalmers here, who's a contemporary kind of dualist, and he might, I guess dualists, obviously Descartes didn't think animals are conscious, but dualists think there's an intimate connection, causal connection, really intimate between the mind and the brain. Descartes said we're not just. I'm going to stop rambling. We get to the point. Maybe David Chalmers would say, be perfectly happy with plant consciousness and say, yeah, there's in plants there's an intimate connection between growth and consciousness, and a bit. Could they not say that? I don't know. I need to think about it more. But what do you think? What would you say to David Chalmers if he said that?
Wow. Batting out of my league here. No, I'm teasing. Yeah, I mean, I think, but if I'm understanding your question correctly, there's a way in which, okay. I don't think growth could be juxtaposed to matter in the way that mind is juxtaposed to matter in a dualist perspective. Is that what you're arguing? And I can elaborate on why I don't think that is the case.
That's what I was imagining. I'm not sure what I think.
Well, because growth in a plant is deeply cellular. So, for example, if you're a human, in your embryonic form, you're never going to change shape. Like, you pretty much, since you're an embryo, you have the shape you're going to have. For a plant, that is not true. Like, it's morphing in every moment, and thus its thinking, its cognition is deeply material. I don't think there's any way in which you could construe growth in that frame as something other than being deeply material. It's propagating new cells. Plants are modular. They don't have any centralized units. There are many different units that are constantly propagating and growing. And for me, that's something that's very hard to construe in any way that's not deeply, deeply material. It's deeply plastic.
Yeah,
Marcus.
So my question is for Rachael. I'm hoping that you can elaborate this very fascinating point that you made. You've repeated it several times, this idea that plants have 15 senses that humans do not. So this is just a minor question, but I'm wondering, what are some of those senses? Can you provide just a few and an example of how they work?
Yeah, so plants, for example, sense gravity differently than we do. I don't know, Christine, if you have any. Yeah, I'll call my colleagues here.
Can we suggest a book?
Yeah, let's do it.
I would suggest reading Zoe Schlanger's recent book, The
yes.
Light Eaters. I think it's a really good overview of the current field, and she goes into the 15 senses, not in super depth, but talks about different studies where they've been explored. And I think that's a great way if plant neurobiology is of interest to you, a great way of being introduced to where the field is at.
One fun one too is that plant roots can sense objects before they hit them. So basically, can sense a rock that they are growing towards and then can grow around it. That's a cool one.
Yeah.
All right, I think Emma is next, then Ian, and then Nigel.
Hi, I'm approaching this from the perspective of an applied ethicist thinking of moving into a career in horticulture. I guess the question I have, it sort of links to this, what is at stake? And the thought that vegans are sort of running a mile from all of this consciousness stuff. If plants have consciousness, if they have a richer consciousness, then that seems to have a lot of ethical implications for how I do my gardening, whether I'm uprooting things. Do you have any ideas about how we approach these questions? How we can decide how to garden, what the ethical implications are, if plants have a sort of a richer consciousness than we do, if they're sort of more than we are.
Can I take this? Yeah.
Can I respond to that? Yeah. So the first thing that I would note is that there is an anxiety between indigenous cosmologies who engage with relational experiences with plants and view them as what we are calling conscious, and a sort of very committed veganism of how can you then eat something that's conscious. And I would turn to what are cultural examples in which plants are considered conscious. What are the ethics within those different cultures? So am arguing that consciousness is culturally derived. It's through a cultural frame that you experience who is conscious, and you decide who is conscious and who isn't. And most relational ontologies have some sort of ritual tools for what reciprocity looks like, what care looks like, and including, that's why I started with Gaelic-speaking areas, because they're grouped under the West, is to say that there in the material is this experience of speaking directly to the plant, caring for the plant, being involved in spreading the plant's seeds, providing nutrients in order to feel that it's, and again, with what Rachel was saying, plants have purposes of their own that are not the same purposes as ours because their embodiment is different than ours. So how we engage with compost is really important. How we deal with seeds is really important. And again, I would say look to what are the cultural relationships with the landscapes in which different cultures have evolved alongside their non-human kin, and how they talk about them and how they care for one another.
Mm-hmm. Can I also just add an evolutionary perspective on that, which you've heard me say before, but from a strictly evolutionary point of view, like some plants might want to be eaten, right? Because this is how they disperse their seeds and reproduce. Yep. And then I just wanted to add one quick thing to Rachel's point about how vegans show up to the first plant group and then don't return. So, I tend to be more of adopt more of an eco-feminist position, emphasizing relationality, as Natalia was talking about. But from a strictly utilitarian perspective, animal agriculture kills way more plants than regular agriculture. So that's always a good answer to vegans being really afraid of the idea of plant consciousness.
Okay, we go to Ian.
So thanks. On the veganism question, life is all about things dying and living together. Yeah. The process of life is to do with death. Yeah. The opposite of life is not death, it's machine. But I think that's very important, actually. So in your gut there are trillions of cells, and if it's true that a single cell has intelligence, and I do believe the evidence, I'm not going to go over it now, then all these intelligent beings are inside you being killed and excreted and all sorts of, that's how you live. On thinking as motion, I just wanted to mention that in Darwin's last work in 1874, he describes what he calls circumnutation, which is not mutation, but nutation of roots in which they are exploring the environment as a way in which the plant has a brain. He used that term. We don't have to use it, but he was making very vividly that motion is cognition. And finally, the Galliano experiment with the Y-shaped tube. I mean, the thing that's so extraordinary about that is that it was a random connection between a puff of air and knowing where the light was coming from. And in the control experiment, the puff of air came down the channel where the light was not going to come. And both sets of plants learnt this. They demonstrated their understanding by motion within a matter of days. It's extraordinary. Thank you.
Okay, Lucas and then Katie.
Thank you. Hi. First of all, wonderful job, everyone. That was really, really illuminating. I was a little surprised at all the comments about veganism because to me, it's a deeply compatible philosophy. As someone who was raised vegan, to me, it's hardly about what you eat or what sort of plants you're digging up, but it's a way of seeing the world. It's my way of arriving at similar principles that some religious people might have of my mom would say tread lightly around the earth and be mindful of how you're relating to even the spider in your bathroom, right? I don't know. So that's sort of more of an ethical principle that to me is very compatible with the idea of plant consciousness. So I guess the question I had was how your thinking around plant consciousness has informed your personal moral philosophies and how you sort of move about the world.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, I don't know if it's my moral philosophy per se, but actually no, I do think it is moral. I would say apprenticing to plants has radically changed my sensorium, Like and the speed with which I engage and observe beings. Like I will literally spend time just sitting observing a tree. I'm a Zen practitioner, and I wrote a piece about this for Tricycle magazine. And there's a way in which my sort of Zen practice has become very influenced by observing trees and sort of it's become a sort of Corbin-inspired imaginal practice, where as I'm sitting, I'm sort of thinking about the fact that they're thrumming with life, with these 15 senses, which I apparently can't name for you, but that are happening and that are sort of, beyond my ability to apprehend. In theology, we talk about apophatic theology, which is a theology that is premised on the imperfection of human knowledge and the idea that God is, you can approximate God, but you can never quite get there. And I sort of practice like an apophatic botany, where it's like, I'm sort of always feeling into my own limits. And I think, again, it's that odd humility that's coming up again and again. And I would like to think that humility is translating into my interactions with other beings as well. Yeah.
Do either of you want to answer?
Compost. Spend time in the garden, spend time in the woods. Like Rachel said, that's been so central. I lived in cities on and off for from 18 to till I was 30, and then I have spent a good deal of the last many years moving back and forth between the woods and the city, and just really spending as much time watching, like what Rachel said, and paying attention to relationships. And yeah, compost everything. We should honor rot.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think it's implicit in what you were both describing, but engaging with these questions, I think, puts you into a different kind of relationship with plants, one that is more responsive. So it's not just, I'm relating to this being, but this being is relating to me, or dependent on me, or curious about me in some way too.
Katie.
Thank you. This is wonderful. Emma and I were talking last night about our love of gardening, and it wasn't apropos of your chat. So then to hear this today is, just been fabulous. And I'm reminded of Cicero, right? You only need a library and a garden to be happy. So true. My question was around the Aristotle hangover, alongside Heraclitus and Thales. I wondered whether you'd ever looked at the myth of Orpheus as an expression of your studies, or your beliefs rather.
Oh yes, certainly. I also just finished doing an intensive on looking at Spenser's poetry and Milton's Paradise Lost, and thinking about how the relationship to antiquity and the retelling of different myths presents different ways of thinking about the interspecies relationships that occurred in Ovid or in Virgil, or that are being presented in those spaces. And the way that Spenser writes the Garden of Adonis and retells this relationship between Venus and Adonis, but in this garden space where he's presenting a theory of reincarnation that is oddly Originian in many ways. Like there's just I think that's the thing, though. It kind of goes with the history of reception. So often we have these materials that are presenting these incredibly rich worlds, including the Gaelic materials I brought up today, and they have been traditionally read through in the last, however long, this very specific ontological and epistemological lens that is not allowing often for relationship to be the center thing. And then once you bring it in, you're like, oh, of course. I see it everywhere now. It's almost overwhelming how everywhere it is. But that it kind of takes that, I think, initial questioning of what's the history of reception, what were the guiding political or economic values that wrote the commentaries on the materials that have these beautiful relationships present within them. I hope that kind of answers your question. I don't know.
I think we're at time, and I just want to, before we thank the panelists, I just want to highlight two questions I heard, two really important questions. John's about how might we be wrong, how would we know that we're wrong, and Emma's, which was that she anticipated Nigel's, about sort of the ethical implications of a wider ambit for consciousness. But it's curious to me that those questions came up in the conversation about plant consciousness, but not in the conversation about subatomic particle consciousness. So what is it about plant consciousness that prompts us to think, how might we be wrong, or what are the ethical implications? But no one said, how could you be wrong about a quark having consciousness? Which I think is also a really interesting question. How would we be wrong about that or be right about that? In any case, so those are questions I think we should continue to ponder. I think this was a wonderful investigation. Thank you three so much, and thank you all for your brilliant questions and comments. So let's give them a round of applause.